Welcome back to Brock's Hammer, everybody. And today we're going to be talking about warp spiders. And we're going to be going into how to make the best use out of them, because they're a little bit of a tricky unit to use, but they are very powerful. And they're considered one of the top tier units in our codex. But again, they have a very high skill cap as far as how to use them properly and so forth. They're not easy to use. They're not like a couple units that we have in our army that are more straightforward. They're kind of like swooping hawks, except, to be honest with you, harder to use. Swooping hawks, in my opinion, are they can be tricky at first, but once you get the hang of them, they're really easy to know where to go and stuff like that. With warp spiders, it's much harder, in my opinion, especially if you're trying to trying to get away from shooting attacks and things like that. So yeah, let's jump right into it. So what we're going to be doing in this video is, first of all, we're going to be overviewing, of course, all the stats, weapon options, Exarch powers, and special rules that the warp spiders have available to give us a little refresher on what warp spiders can do. We're also going to look at their general strengths and weaknesses as a unit. And lastly, probably the most important part of this video is going to be the different tips and tricks you can do with warp spiders. So looking at their basic stat line, 20 points a model. They're priced pretty well for what they are. They're very fast, 12 movement, and they're not quite as fast as swooping hawks, but they do have some better battle focus ability. So in a way, we'll go into that though. They can move freely through terrain. And the cool thing about them is they basically have the fly special rule without having the downsides of having fly. So basically what that means is that normally models like anti-aircraft units and things like that, or certain units might have anti-flyer abilities. They'll have a +1 to hit against flyers, a +1 to wound against flyers, things like that. Warp spiders do not have the fly special rule, so they're not affected by it. And they have a decent save, and otherwise they have pretty average shooting stats for a shooty aspect warrior. And when you look at their shooting weapons, they have a very good shooting weapon, but it's short-ranged and it's less effective versus small units because it has the blast keyword. Now, a lot of you might be thinking, well, on average, you'll get about 3 to 4 hits with this thing, even against small units. And that is very true. You're going to get an average of 3 to 4 hits, typically, if you did the math on it, which isn't bad. It's actually fairly decent, but the range is incredibly short, only range 12. You have to get really close to the enemy to be able to use this. Now, the Exarch can take an extra death spinner for free, basically, so you always want to take that. Of course, I'm glad they did that because the actual Exarch model has 2 death spinners, and there's no way to model them without having 2 death spinners. And he has the ability to take power blades. Now, the thing about power blades is that when you look at them, it's basically a power sword with 1 additional attack, right? And it's 10 points. Now, I would probably never take power blades. I think there's some combinations where you might want to take power blades, because if you do, you get access to the Spider's Bite relic if you use relics of the ancient shrines. But here's the thing about it. It's really not that powerful. And the Spider's Bite is only slightly more powerful, honestly, than the power blades. It does do damage too and so forth. And it is better. But the problem with it is that when are you ever really going to have your Exarch in close combat with all the abilities that warp spiders have to get out of combat? Probably not often. So honestly, I've never found use for it personally, and I would only consider it if you have really no other choice. So for example, let's say you only have 2 units of aspect warriors in your army with the Exarch power, and you're thinking to yourself, well, I gave the Phoenix Plume to my swooping hawks, I might as well just give Spider's Bite to my warp spiders. It's more of a might as well thing and not really something you plan on taking. If you have the extra points for it, and if you're going to give an Exarch relic anyway, there's certain situations where you might think, well, I might as well do it. And maybe in the late game, at some point, the Warp Spider Exarch, if he's alive and he's the last one in the unit, can charge into something and kill it. I mean, that's the only really thing I see about it. I've never been in that situation, though. My Warp Spiders have pretty much either survived or been annihilated. So there's that. And mostly they've just survived. And we'll go into the thing that helps them out the most, and that is the Warp Spider Jump Generator. Now, this is the unit's way of getting out of trouble and setting your opponent into traps that they really can't get out of that easily, especially infantry units. These guys are great at running circles around infantry units, in cover, near difficult terrain, things like that, so they're moving slower and you're moving faster. You can move right out of terrain, no problem. Horizontally or vertically, it doesn't matter because these guys essentially have fly when they move without the downsides of fly. And in addition, they can move 2d6 for their battle focus. So they can move in 12 inches, through terrain, hit an enemy unit, and then move 2d6 inches out of that same piece of terrain with no issues. Now, to my understanding, the -3 inches for moving through area terrain on battle focus still applies to this. So you have to be careful with that. Basically, essentially what that means is that when you roll your dice, you'll probably roll a 7, right? And when you roll that 7, you're going to be at -3. So you're only going to be moving 4 inches. So make sure that if you move into terrain, you have enough movement to get out of that piece of terrain onto the other side of it so that you can either be out of line of sight or out of assault range. Both of those things are extremely important for Warp Spiders because they are very fragile. A lot of people will look at their armor save and say, oh man, these guys have a great armor save. They have Space Marine armor. They really don't. They're toughness 3, they don't have armor of contempt, and they're not cheap. So you can't afford to lose them like that. There's a lot of weapons with, AP that can get these guys a little bit down, so be careful with them. They're not a unit to, throw out there. They're not that durable. And, a lot of people will look at these and say, oh, they have a 5+ invulnerable save too. That's going to really help. And it does help against some stuff, but not usually, because these guys are going to be the target of anti-infantry weapons. It'll help against things like plasma guns, melt-a-guns, occasionally, stuff like that, if the enemy doesn't have anything else to shoot at. But it shouldn't be relied on at all for survival. These guys are very squishy regardless. Then we come to their sudden assault ability. So this is like the other rules in the Codex. It basically allows the unit to deploy as reinforcements, allows the unit to get the first strike on enemies and reach parts of the army that you wouldn't normally be able to reach by deploying normally. More vulnerable parts that maybe the enemy doesn't expect, or maybe the enemy just can't stop. It also allows for some interesting combinations and tricks if your opponent is unaware. And, doesn't screen his units out properly. It becomes extremely hard for your opponent to actually do this later on in the game. He's going to be having to move to objectives. He's not going to be able to afford to screen his army for the entire game. Those troop choices, those tactical Marines or whatever, are going to need to eventually move up to objectives to try to capture them. And that's where Warp Spiders really come in, because they can hit the most vulnerable parts of his army, and then guess what? They can battle focus back, not when they sudden assault, they can't do that, but they can move back, and then they can basically flicker jump when enemies get close. So even if you sudden assault, you'll probably be about 12 inches away from an enemy unit. They can shoot you, but if they try to assault you, they'll most likely be just out of engagement range. You can move 6 inches back and pretty much be safe from anything but enemy shooting. Now, this does something else. It basically makes it so your opponent either has to do one or two things: assault another unit, or just sit there and do nothing. Now, this is important because essentially this makes your opponent choose between two things: sitting there and shooting you and standing still, not moving towards objectives, not doing any of that stuff, or trying to get really close to the warp spiders, which is probably impossible for most units. And at that point, if he's trying to get super close to you, he may actually still fail the charge, depending how good his roll is. Even if he's within, if he's within 2 inches even, he might fail it. There's not a great chance it'll fail, but there's a decent chance it'll even fail with this. So it's a pretty good ability for keeping them safe for assault, and basically denies the enemy some extra movement if he's trying to get on an objective or something like that. So when we're talking about the Warp Spider Exarch powers, there's 3 powers, and I think really 2 of them have the potential to really, pull a lot of shenanigans off with. The other one's a straight damage buff. So when we look at Surprise Assault, this ability increases the number of attacks the unit gets after using the Sudden Assault ability. This is generally more useful on bigger Warp Spider units because you're going to get more attacks out of it. However, I've seen people also put it on smaller units because in general, it is a damage increase. You're most likely going to be using Sudden Assault with these guys, so it does increase their damage. But I would put out this little note. When you actually do the math on Surprise Assault, and let's say you have, a unit of 5 Warp Spiders, you're going to get 6 extra attacks, right? On average, 4 more are going to hit, and about 3 are going to wound. So you might get 1 more wound with this ability. That is only 1 more wound, and it only works once. It doesn't work for the entire game. So only getting 1 more wound, in my opinion, on a smaller unit isn't really worth it in most cases. I know it's extra damage, and a lot of players will say, well, damage is damage. 1 extra wound is 1 extra wound. Yes, that's true, but at the end of the day, what are you paying for? You could pay those points that you spent on your Exarch power for something else that can do much more. And I actually think it is good with larger units because you're going to get an extra kill out of it, which might be enough, honestly, to, provide you that extra incentive. Let's say that you wanted to take out a unit, a unit of 5, Space Marines on an objective. Maybe a unit of 5 Warp Spiders isn't quite enough. You have a unit of 10 and you want to make sure that unit dies. All right, I understand that. It's not going to do much for a small unit. Now, Web of Deceit, on the other hand, basically allows the unit to Skyleap once a game using its Battle Focus ability. So just like Skyleap, it can be very useful at misdirecting the enemy. You can come in, shoot, and then instead of moving 2d6 with your Battle Focus, you can just move anywhere on the board. So this allows for some great potential for shenanigans, allows you to get across the board very easily, and be everywhere at once, which is exactly what the Warp Spiders want to be doing. Misdirecting enemy movement, deployment, and also being able to grab objectives across the board. Now, this last one is Spider's Lair. So when I first read this ability, I didn't like it. I really had an issue with it because I just felt like it didn't do enough, and it was only once a game. However, I looked at it more and I used it in a couple of my lists, and I found out that it is actually a trickier power to use, but it's really satisfying when you position your units correctly and you use this ability at the right time, because basically it allows you to deny whole areas of the board from your opponent, whole pieces of terrain that your opponent can't enter without taking mortal wounds, and this makes it extremely difficult for them to move through it, and it potentially denies a lot of objective control for your enemy, makes their positioning a lot worse, and more. And I've had so many situations where I've dropped these guys in a piece of terrain turn 2 that the enemy was planning on occupying later in the game, denying that piece from them, and then, them not really being able to move in it, or, having to move around it, costing your opponent movement, which can cost them the ability to get objectives later on. Especially if you land yourself in a large and important piece of terrain, like a ruin in the middle of the field. There's a lot of ways you can make potential use out of this ability, but basically, as long as there's at least one enemy unit that's planning to move through it, it can be very difficult for your opponent to actually justify moving a unit through it if he knows that he will be taking D3 mortal wounds every time. So if he plans to move in it, D3 mortal wounds. If he plans to charge, D3 mortal wounds. And on top of that, you still get your flicker jump and so forth. So really useful ability if used correctly. And later in this video, I'm going to show you some unique and cool ways to use it. Now, as for the strengths and weaknesses of the unit in general, they're really fast and can evade combat very easily. That's without a doubt. They have really powerful shooting, strength 6, AP, -2 weapons with D6 shots is nothing to laugh at. And with the blast keyword, especially against larger units, this unit really shines for its points. And they're very good at area denial and board control. However, I think the weaknesses of this unit is that they're pretty fragile to enemy shooting if you're not careful with them. If you don't play with a lot of line of sight blocking terrain, at least 4 pieces of line of sight blocking terrain, which is obscuring terrain and so forth, they're going to have a very hard time on the battlefield because they're very easy to be shot at, to be honest. Very fragile. And they have a limited range on their weapons, which puts them in even more danger of not necessarily being assaulted, but being shot at. But they're a really well-costed unit, and there's 3 tricks and little tips to use them that I'm going to show you. The first one is what I call the Web of Deceit, and there's a lot of shenanigans you can pull with that one. Then we have the Spider's Lair Trap, which is essentially setting an opponent up to be basically trapped by the Spider's Lair ability. And then we have something called the Dual Spider Ambush. This works if you have 2 units of Warp Spiders, and you put an enemy in a bad position where there's no good choices for him. So the Web of Deceit basically allows the unit to skyleap once a game. And again, this is great for hitting the enemy on one side of the board and then jumping safely to the other side of the board, or on an objective to provide objective control. Now, it only works once a game, but it's very effective in the first opening rounds. And it can be useful later in the game if your Warp Spider unit manages to survive as well in objective control. So I went ahead and drew a little diagram of this. Now, basically, your Warp Spiders are on the left-hand side of the board behind the ruins. The enemy is on the objective. So what you're going to do is you're going to move forward and you're going to shoot them, right? And you're going to move forward your 12. You can move right through the ruins with no penalty because of your warp jump generator. Now, normally you can move back 2d6, but here's the problem with that. You're probably going to end up in the ruin. And eventually, despite the bonuses to your survivability in the ruin, you're probably going to die from something else. You may actually be able to kill that unit on the objective, but the better move here would be to use Web of Deceit. Because what you could either do is, if there's a free objective on the board that's outside of 9, you can jump to that objective and capture it. Or you can jump to the other side of the board, on the other side where you see that ruin over there on the right. You can jump behind this ruin to be able to do the same thing the next turn if a unit of Space Marines or whatever kind of infantry comes on that objective to capture it. So essentially what you're doing is you're using your Warp Spiders to threaten objectives every single turn across the board. And this is going to increase not only your ability to be everywhere at once, which can make it extremely hard for your opponent to actually try to capture things on the battlefield, and make it difficult for you and your movements to predict. But it also can provide late game objective control as well. If the enemy unit doesn't have anything on objective, or if he leaves something open for a turn, the Warp Spiders can take advantage of that instantly. And, then all of a sudden your enemy has to scramble to try to figure a way to clear your Warp Spiders. Now, normally this would be just a shooting, but if you position correctly, the enemy might not have that many units available to shoot at you, especially if you can get behind some ruins. So you see here what I did with the Warp Spiders on the right-hand side that are on the objective. They're the circles with the dots in the middle. That's typically going to be friendly units when I draw these things. Unless an opponent has a lot of enemy troops to the right-hand side of the board in the woods or in the ruin itself, it's going to be very hard for your enemy to shoot because you're kind of at an angle behind the ruins. And therefore, he's either going to have to move in position to shoot them, which could leave him open to other units in your army, like fire prisms and things like that. Or he's just going to have to leave the warp spiders there and try to contest with something smaller. And that could happen as well. He could run, up a squad of 5 Space Marines or something like that onto the objective, not necessarily assault you, but shoot you at a close range and then kind of contest it from there. That's possible. But even so, it's going to be a win-win either way for you, because you're making your opponent make tough choices about what he wants to do with his units. And the next ability is the Spider's Lair. So I call this the Spider's Lair trap. Essentially what this is either using sudden assault to drop into a piece of terrain and using the Spider's Lair ability to deny your opponent the chance to move through it easily. And because Spider's Lair activates at the end of the movement phase, it's perfectly legal to use sudden assault to drop a unit of warp spiders into terrain, as long as you're outside of 9 inches of enemy models, and then use the Spider's Lair ability to web that piece of terrain. It's perfectly legal because the Spider's Lair ability activates at the end of the movement phase, and the reinforcement step is at the end of the movement phase. So essentially, you'll still get the chance to use it even if you use sudden assault. Now, dropping into a piece of terrain that your opponent already occupies is another way to use Spider's Lair, and it makes it harder for them to move through or out of it. And if he's trying to move in it, that could be also very difficult, because he's going to be taking D3 mortal wounds each time. Now, this can be kind of difficult for the Warp Spider unit to pull off, because you still have to be outside of 9 inches of an enemy unit. But I've had plenty of games where there's a semi-large piece of terrain and my opponent deploys in the corner of it, right on the edge, to be able to, threaten objectives and so forth, but still be able to be in the ruin. And basically what's happened is I've dropped in the other corner on the opposite side. And typically, depending on how big the piece of terrain is, you can be outside of 9 inches and still be within the terrain piece. This is more of a rare thing, but it can happen. In most cases, you're probably going to be dropping into a piece of terrain that your opponent wants to move through to get to some sort of objective or things like that. So typically that's going to be the case, but we'll go over both kind of scenarios, and I'm going to show you guys how to use this ability to the best of its potential, because it is a little bit trickier to use in some cases. So our first scenario is going to be dropping your unit within a piece of terrain that your opponent already occupies. So this is what I was kind of talking about before. The objective is on this side of the board, on the left side of the board. Your enemy is going to want to be kind of close to it so that he can capture it later in the game. So what your warp spiders do is they drop on the opposite side of the rune in the corner, and then they use Spider's Lair to make it extremely difficult for that unit to get to the objective. Of course, you're probably also going to shoot the unit as well. Now, basically what this does is it makes the enemy have a hard decision. Okay, I can turn around and try to deal with the warp spiders, or what's left of my unit can deal with them, or I could just run to the objective. But either way, I'm taking damage at less movement, because now I'm moving through difficult ground, and I'm leaving a unit in my backfield who's probably going to score on things like line breaker and things like that. So it puts your opponent in a really bad spot that he really doesn't want to be in, where he has to make a choice between just leaving you to score on secondaries, as well as just leaving your unit alone and alive for the most part, or running to an objective, which in all likelihood he can't make, because now he's at -2 movement and he's also going to take D3 damage. So he either stays still and the objective is safe, or he turns around to deal with your warp spiders, which also is not an optimal choice for him. So you're making him basically choose between two suboptimal choices. Now, the other way to use warp spiders is kind of move them into a piece of terrain just normally, or sudden assault them, and drop it into, basically use your Spider's Lair ability on a piece of terrain that you know your opponent's going to have to move through. So, for example, right here, we have warp spiders moving into this ruin or sudden assaulting into the ruin, either way, and dropping that spider's lair. So those two units, that unit in the crater that's an enemy unit and the unit on the other side of the ruins that was trying to get out of line of sight of our units, if they want to move through that ruin now, they're going to have to take D3 mortal wounds each time they move. And if they want to assault the warp spiders can easily just jump back 6 inches with their flicker jump onto that objective. Now, here's the thing about this, is that if you use sudden assault, you cannot use battle focus. But if you just move normally, you can move up into the ruins, shoot, drop your spider's lair, and then move outside of the ruins about, probably, and I say 7 inches on there, but realistically, without any kinds of, bonuses or anything like that, you're probably going to move about 4 inches. So you might not be able to get completely back on the objective unless you use something like Fire and Fade, which might not always be that useful. But if you can get at least a couple of models on the objective, you can at least start capturing it. So, usually though, you're going to roll pretty average for battle focus. And if you move into terrain, remember, battle focus, unfortunately, you're at -3 to your distance if you move back. So you have to be careful with it, and you have to weigh your options and see if using the command points for something like Fire and Fade would be worth it. Now remember, you can't use Fire and Fade the turn you come in from sudden assault, because with Fire and Fade, if you are uneligible, to make a battle focus move, I believe you can't also make a Fire and Fade move that turn if you come in from reinforcements and stuff. You know what? Excuse me. I'm incorrect on that. It's just that you can't use a battle focus move in the same turn you use Fire and Fade. But you can actually use Fire and Fade after sudden assault. So I was incorrect. I just remembered that. So you can, in fact, if you wanted to, sudden assault into that ruin and Fire and Fade back on the objective 7 inches. It is 2 command points, but it is something you might want to consider if you want to capture the objective and make it harder for enemy units who want to move towards that objective to capture it to actually do so. And essentially what this does also is it makes it pretty impossible for your opponent to even move into terrain like this. And most of the time your warp spiders are going to be safe from a lot of enemy shooting as well. At least those 2 units right there probably will be unwilling to step in that terrain, knowing that the warp spiders are waiting for them. And so is the Spider's Lair ability. So the last thing that I want to talk about is something that I've noticed that works very well in a couple of games that I've played with 2 units of warp spiders. And it works great with isolated assault units or units that are moving to capture objectives on the edges of the battlefield. So basically what this is 1 unit of spiders drops into the front of the unit and another unit of spiders behind. And if your opponent is on an objective and he survives the spider shooting, basically he can either stay on the objective and sit there, move forward towards the objective, he's not already on it, or he can try to move back to prevent one of your units from scoring secondaries such as line breaker and stuff like that. But if he does this, he's always going to have a unit of warp spiders at his back hounding him the entire time. He can only do one thing a turn, basically. He can't do both. So if we look at this diagram here, this is essentially what I'm talking about. This is probably a turn 3 scenario where your 2 units of warp spiders were held in reserve until turn 3. And he has, he moved forward with one of his rhinos. He dumped out 10 Space Marines on the objective and basically said, okay, take it from me, right? I have 10 Space Marines on it. That's a lot of objective secured. I don't think you're going to be able to put something like a Viper on it or something like that to be able to contest because, they're troop choices. So, yeah, I'm going to capture this objective and I'm going to use my Rhino maybe to screen out other units that might be an issue, right? So you drop in your 2 units of warp spiders, 1 unit behind, 1 unit in the front. Or maybe you just drop in 1 unit in the back with sudden assault and the other unit was deployed normally. Whatever way it is, as long as you have one unit behind, and one in front. Now, basically what happens here is you shoot at one of his units with the 2 units, and you basically eradicate them, right? You kill them. So you kill 5 Space Marines. Now, your opponent either has 2 choices at this point. He could stay there and sit on the objective and capture it and get points on it, right? Which is normal. You know, your opponent is going to score on certain objectives throughout the game. And as an Eldar player, we have to kind of get used to the fact that, okay, well, if he has objective secured units, like, 10 Space Marines on an objective, it's going to be rare for us to be able to contest that. It just is. Just the style of our army doesn't really fit with that kind of thing. So it's going to be hard to take away from him. So what we do is we let him have it for a turn. But basically, he has a choice at this point. He can't just, if he just sits there and does nothing but shoot at us, he's not going to be able to save his unit for the next turn because they're going to eventually die. So they're kind of out in the open. And to be honest with you, a lot of Space Marine players have basically this, credence, I guess, where if they move 5 tactical Space Marines on an objective, they don't really expect them to survive. But in this way, if they're moving 10 models on an objective and they're really, going hard for that objective, this is a fantastic way to essentially pincer the enemy, score on secondaries yourself, while at the same time being able to kind of give your enemy a countdown, a death clock, if you would, to where he has to abide by it. So either he has to move back in the Rhino to save his other unit, which might be the case, or he has to just sit on the objective and let that unit die. And in both scenarios, he's not going to be really able to make a great choice because, again, if he moves the models into the Rhino, then you can capture that objective or contest that objective much easier. Remember, Rhinos are not objective secured units. So you can move an objective secured unit on there yourself and capture it, or you can move a non-objective secured unit and also capture it as long as it's more than one model. So either way, your opponent's going to be forced into a rough position where either he has to lose that unit, or if he tries to save the unit, he's not going to score on the objective. And if he tries to move off it to engage either one of your Warp Spider units, again, he's not going to be scoring on that objective. So there's a lot of different things that you can do with Warp Spiders to make them really tricky, really hard, and really able to contest and deny enemies objectives that normally he would be able to capture. So in conclusion, I think Warp Spiders are units that are hard to use. Even in those scenarios I talked to you about, sometimes against a really good opponent, they can be hard to set up. Usually that's why I like to wait until turn 3, but on turn 2 even, sometimes you just have to bring them in. It depends on what's going on in the game. But when used correctly, Warp Spiders can be absolutely devastating to your opponent's objective designs. So, again, Spider's Lair denies a lot of area terrain for your opponent. Web of Deceit allows you to be in multiple places at once, allows you to threaten multiple objectives in the course of a couple turns. And while their damage is also pretty good, and personally, I don't think it's the best out there as far as, actual just raw damage dealing, but it is really very decent shooting. But the real strength really lies in the kind of traps they can set up for enemy units and the leverage they can put against your opponents in objective style matched play missions. They're really fantastic at attacking the flanks. They're not a middle ground unit, by the way. They're not a unit that is going to ride up the middle of the battlefield. They're a unit that's going to stay on the flanks. They're going to stay hidden, attack when vulnerable units present themselves, or when they need to jump in to deny a piece of area terrain from your opponent. They're a utility unit that does a lot of damage, is really good at scoring on secondaries like Linebreaker, as well as contesting enemy objectives and denying whole areas of the board from your opponent. Very good unit. Honestly, I think there's a reason why this unit is such a fantastic addition to a lot of the faster kind of Eldar armies out there. And especially when you think about the fact that, warp spiders can do much more than just do damage and then run away, right? So swooping hawks are a unit that can provide great kind of objective control at all points in the game. Swooping hawks are fantastic. But what they don't do is they don't deny areas of terrain from your opponent like warp spiders can, or be able to hit enemies and then move away as well as they can from enemy assaults and things like that. Once a swooping hawk unit is down on an objective, it has no way of preventing itself from getting assaulted. Where warp spiders have flicker jump and, they have a little bit more durability to shooting and things like that. So both great units, but I think, I did a video earlier on where I compared them. And I think it still holds true that in most cases, when you're choosing between warp spiders and swooping hawks, you really want to kind of understand what you need to actually achieve in the game, what you need in your list. I think one unit of swooping hawks is usually enough, but having one unit of swooping hawks and maybe 2 warp spider units might not be a bad way to provide yourself a lot of objective control on the battlefield, be able to deny areas of terrain for your opponent, all while being able to remain hidden yourself and preserve these units until the late game, where they'll be devastating at just capturing objectives and cleaning up basically the remainders of your enemy army. Okay, that's it for today's video on warp spiders. I think they're a great unit overall, but if you have any kind of tips or tricks you want to share about the use of warp spiders, let me know in the comments. I'd really be interested to know how you guys are using warp spiders, if you're using them in kind of similar ways or if you're using them differently. Let me know. I'd really like to find out. I did mention that surprise assault is not something I typically use with a unit of 5 warp spiders, but if you guys have any differences of opinions, let me know. I'd love to hear it. All right, everybody. That's it for today's video. I will see you guys next time. Peace out, everybody. Have a great one. See you later.